Great. So good morning. My name is Peter Reed. I'm Senior Deputy Director here at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning for a conversation with artist Tania Bruguera and Stuart Comer, who's Chief Curator of Media and Performance Art here at MoMA. And as you know, this is the press preview for the exhibition titled Tania Bruguera, Untitled, Havana 2000. That's the name of the exhibition, which is going to open to the public on February 3rd and remain on view through March 11th. There's one detail I want to mention, which is, although we're open 7 days a week, this is an interesting installation and complex installation, and needs to be closed on Mondays for kind of routine maintenance. So that's unusual for us. But before we get into a discussion with Stuart and Tania, I do want to recognize a number of supporters for this exhibition, most notably that this temporary exhibition has been made possible by the Jill and Peter Krause Fund for Contemporary Exhibitions. It's an endowed fund here at the museum. And we also received special support from the Modern Women's Fund, which is another special fund here at MoMA to support all kinds of activities, exhibitions, acquisitions, public programs around women artists. And lastly, the annual exhibition fund, which many of our friends and members contribute to, and we're grateful for that kind of support. As I mentioned, this exhibition has been organized by Stuart Comer, Chief Curator of Media and Performance Art, and he was ably assisted by his assistant, Martha Joseph, who's here today. And Martha, thank you. You've been heroic in this. And this is a project, an exhibition that involves live performance. And we are blessed at MoMA by having two fantastic producers, Lizzie Gorfaine, Kate Scherer, who mastermind those kinds of details. So it's been quite a team to produce this exhibition. And I thought we might start by just saying that, to remind you, the project, Untitled Havana 2000, was originally presented in Havana at the biennial, the Cuban Biennial, the 7th Cuban Biennial in the year 2000. And it's a project that, despite the picture you see on the screen, is actually quite hard to see. It's not really photographable. We'll talk about that later. But given that we've got both an audience here in the auditorium, but also a large audience today who's live streaming this event, I thought maybe we could just begin by having Stuart, if you could just describe what is on view in the galleries. What should the visitors expect? Because this is an unusual exhibition.
What's very interesting, and I should mention at the outset that I'm one of the very small handful of people who were able to encounter the original installation in Havana in 2000 before the Cuban authorities censored it and shut it down. And I know we'll get into issues around censorship in Cuba and Tania's very direct relationship with issues of power and the government there. But to Peter's point, in an era of Instagram and hyper-visibility, this piece really does take a very different approach. And of course, it was made well before the advent of cell phone cameras and Instagram. But the fact that it really forces us to slow down and think as much as we're actually trying to look, and to really begin to experience on a more sensorial level and a corporeal level the histories that the piece seeks to enunciate, I think is a very important factor in this. Having encountered it in 2000, it never left me. I've continued to dwell on this piece for a very long time. And I think I just wanted to also make one more key point before I get into the details of what one will experience, which Tania, as a Cuban artist, really did come out of a very rich legacy of performance in Cuba. I think the best known artist would probably be Ana Mendieta, and Ana's work was a direct reference to many projects that Tania did. But having come out of a career in which most of her performance was focused on her own body, it was really with this piece in 2000 that she shifted it to a more social encounter, really opening it up to a participatory experience for the visitor, where she herself was no longer the performer, but it was instead almost like a tableau vivant. And that was at a moment at the turn of the century where artists like Santiago Sierra and a number of others were actively doing what was sort of called delegational performance, where it was no longer the actual individual artist, but the artist creating a social and political stage. And that has had huge repercussions for the work that Tania continues to make. And I think, of course, it's very well known that she herself was incarcerated about 3 years ago. So I think it would be interesting to talk about the relationship between your own imprisonment and the fact that this piece originally took place in a prison. So that prison was in Havana, and it was decided that the Havana Biennial would use it as a site for installations and artworks. It has a very dark history. Long before the revolution, even during colonial times, it was used as a site for execution, murder, and torture. And during the revolution, it was also used specifically to imprison and torture and kill counter-revolutionaries. So Tania, when presented with the opportunity to use this space, really did want to reflect on power and the abuses of power and the fragility of citizenship in those situations. I think these are all concerns that really chime strongly with us in the current moment. Effectively, when you walk into the piece, you're immersed in complete darkness, but you're hit with a very powerful smell of what you begin to realize is rotting sugarcane bagasse, which is the remnants of milled sugarcane. Sugarcane is, of course, the symbol of the sugar industry, which has a long history and a strong association to the slave trade and to the development of a major economy in the Caribbean that was entirely based on sugar. As you begin to walk into the piece, your eyes slowly adjust and you realize that there is one light source, which is actually a television monitor in the ceiling, which presents found footage detailing Castro both in private and in public life. So swimming in the sea, but also giving formal political speeches. And then there's a crucial moment where he removes his shirt to reveal his bare chest to really prove that he doesn't need a bulletproof vest. He is invincible. And in contrast to that, you begin to realize 4 performers who actually, our performers are walking in as I speak, who stand naked around the monitor, almost as if they're guarding it. And Tania can talk a little bit. We've talked a lot about the art historical references from which this derives, maybe most importantly Michelangelo's slaves, but this goes back to Roman antiquity and sort of the Atlas figures who would guard something, a situation or a person in power. But in this case, the nudity is no longer in marble. It is real flesh and blood, and I think it has an incredibly intense and emotional charge for many viewers. And then, as Tania often says, what you really feel in your body, you never forget. And I think that's absolutely been my experience of this work.
That's a great prelude, a kind of description of this environment that the visitors will experience, and we'll talk about a number of things here, I think. But Tania, as we launch into this, do you want to take us back to 2000 for a moment to think this was a turning point in your work? But I'm really curious about, since I wasn't there in 2000, what was the setting? What was the environment and the response? What happened?
Well, before answering, I just want to say thank you to the whole technical team from Matthew, Marta, Lizzie, Kate, Laura, and the amazing performers, which I know we talk first name, so I have their full name here, so I do. So the great performers who have done a great job is, they have a lot to do yet, because we're starting now, is Ian de Leon, Rui Gerson, Jonathan Gonzalez, Ernesto Manuel Lopez, Kyle Lopez, Mickey Gerano, Alexis Riseco, and Jake Sokolov Gonzalez. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. As people have seen in the show, when they are not present, there is a total different piece. So thank you for that. Going back to 2000, it was a moment of change. Cuba is always changing, so it's funny how this is being portrayed like, oh, it's changed. Oh, yeah, we're always changing. But in the year 2000, it was a very specific moment because 2 reasons mainly. The Cuban government for a long, long time, when I was a child, they always talk about the year 2000 as the year where we're going to achieve almost communism, like everything will be better, la libreta de abastecimiento, which is the rationing card, will be eliminated, like things will be better. And the year 2000 arrived and we were all like, oh, what happened? You know? And that also created this sense of frustration, and also the socialist Eastern countries were crumbling, and there was a lot of crisis ideologically. We just came through a special period. And the other element was that the Americans, in that year specifically for the biennial, came in mass. We call it the American invasion in the arts, because everybody was using the little openness the permit for cultural travel can give you to go there. So I was studying at the Art Institute, so I heard all my friends like, are you going to Cuba? I'm going to finally go to Cuba. I'm going to see. And I realized that they were not going to see Cuba. They were going to live this dream they had for 30 years about what the country was, and they were going to force the reality to be whatever they already have decided before they arrived. And that's how the piece was reacting to that, to this idea of the political imaginary that you create without experiencing the place. And for me, the message was this: everybody was going to see the big revolution, the leader, but what about the people?
So fast forward for a moment. You were part of the American invasion then in 2000. But it was only, it was in 2015, a few years, nearly 3 years ago, that you acquired this piece, Stuart, for MoMA, and now we're presenting it. So this is really interesting. It's a totally different setting for a re-performance, and I'm really curious what dialogue took place between the two of you in terms of the issues around what it means to even acquire this work in a museum in New York City, what it means to restage it. It's an incredibly elaborate installation upstairs, and I'm sure you must have planned this together, and I haven't heard about this, but I'm curious what issues really drove the two of you to make this a success, or, to your point, an experience that is the key to this work, to understanding this work and your intentions.
I mean, one thing I should just mention, I think, as we continue to attempt to construct a history of performance or understand what performance means after its original iteration, it becomes more and more clear that certain projects can and should be restaged, and other things really function better in documentation. So this is a major difference than other art forms, because painting largely is painting and you need to see it. It's not a matter of restaging it. There may be conservation questions. But then when it comes to the representational role of art in terms of a very political situation like this is where it gets very interesting for me. So in the sense that all of the political histories that we've both just outlined come directly to bear in the bodies of the performers, because at least 2 or 3 of them have relatives that were killed or tortured in similar prisons. So the energy that something like that, the sort of the body-to-body transmission of these histories exists in physical space in a performance like this in a very different way than it would in a painting like Picasso's Guernica, for instance, which is a very powerful artwork, needless to say. But I'm very interested just in terms of what it means to represent history through a living situation rather than a recorded image. So this is something we talked a lot about, and I think it did feel, there have been 2 other attempts to recreate this piece, one at the Venice Biennale in 2015, sorry, and also at the Neuberger Museum at SUNY Purchase in 2010. And so for this occasion, we felt there were enough precedents to try to do this that it made sense. Other performance works that we've acquired sometimes require, involving documentation, sketchbooks and notebooks, preparatory materials. If we're lucky, video interviews with the artist or with the performers involved. For this piece, it's sort of all of that and more. And I think as we go along, we've had very detailed conversations with our conservation department, and certainly with Tania. Increasingly, we'll want to hear from the performers and also from the audience, and really try to construct a multidimensional way of documenting this piece, because again, you can't really capture it in an image. It's deeply sensorial. So we're trying to find ways to kind of create a new protocol for how you inscribe the history of the piece in the collection here.
And talking about that a little more, I think all the performers are either Cuban or from Cuban descent. So I think the knowledge that you acquire in your own body is also present, the personal history you have. And in this sense, we also have set up with Athenia, Athena, the possibility for some people that are Cubans who come to see a show or other people to record their experience, especially we have a person that is going to come that has been in prison in that place before. So it would be really good to keep that as a store that knowledge for the piece. And I feel we did it twice before, but for me, I'm saying this publicly, this is the definitive version. So we were very careful about not only the mechanics of the piece, but also to understand how can we translate an experience that was happening in one specific place, in one specific emotional, political time, into today. And I think there are elements beyond our design in the United States now that help us to make those connections. But I think we were very careful at seeing how can we make sure that people have the appropriate context to enter the piece. So it's not only a generic experience, but it's experience related to a country and a time.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Actually, if I understand that correctly, 4 people are allowed in at a time, right? In this very dark, cave-like bunker. And there are 4 performers in there as well. So it's a very, it's not a spectacle. It's a very quiet environment. It's a very dark environment. And you referred to, the images of sort of art historical tradition of the male body or of slaves and so forth, but there's also that sense of darkness. And I'm just wondering if you would talk a little bit about about that experience of what this darkness means to you, or what kind of, how you think about the visitor going through this journey, the encounter.
I think for me, symbolically, darkness had to do with how much knowledge you have of the place, but also how much will you have to know. So I think that is also encaptured with the walking through the space. But this piece was also important for me because I also discovered that many times we have this tendency to be very patronizing the spectator, in the sense that they have to see, everybody has to see the same thing, everybody has to have the whole experience. And in this piece I discovered that as in politics, as in difficult experiences, not everybody wants to go all the way. In the original piece, some people did the line, and after they arrived, they were so threatened by it, they were not daring to get in. And that's okay, So I think that for me was the discovering and the behavior of the audience as part of the meaning of the piece. Another thing that I feel is important too is before you enter the piece, which is the cue, the line. I was reading this morning this article from an ethnographer and talking about precisely how totalitarian, autocratic governments or repressive governments love to set the mood in the population of waiting, the idea of waiting. And I think in Cuba we do lines for everything. For 50 years we have been doing long lines for absolutely crazy, simple things. And I think this idea of people going through waiting is very important to prepare them for the piece.
And in terms of another historical reference that I think is crucial to really think about in relation to this work is Plato's Cave. Maybe it's obvious, but the more I've thought about it, the more rich it gets. And, this notion that obviously the prisoners can only see one thing, which is the shadows of reality on the wall. So what they're seeing is a fabricated, manufactured version of reality, but they can't distinguish between the two things. And I think in the original text it talks about, the shadows are their the prisoner's reality is the shadows, because that's all they know. And that when one is finally set free, that one sees the world in a fundamentally different way. And so I think there are many ways to think about darkness on a metaphorical level, but for me it really does come back to this metaphor of Plato's cave. And again, this situation that we're currently in, where things are forced to be visible, and yet so many people and conditions remain invisible because people in power don't want us to see them. So I think this work really hinges on this idea of who is visible and who is not, and why.
Tania, much of your work, as I understand it, since Havana, since 2000, since this project began, is, as you say, about the experience, and it's about a kind of provocation. I don't know to what degree you're provoking, it's almost in this one, again, I come back to that quietness and the darkness. There's almost like a subtle provocation that is so unsubtle because it's a big, almost monumental size scale experience in there for these four people. But let's talk about this moment then. I mean, this is 2018. There is many people feel a certain darkness now, but what's going through your mind again, or in the sense about how we might experience this work now? Why now? Why in New York?
One of the things that I've been more interested at all these years studying power and the behavior of power and the resources of power is the idea of complicity. And sometimes people confuse when you do a performance or a project where you bring into the public arena the complicity people have with power as something scandalous. I think this is important because many of my work, people are like, oh, it's a shock. But no, that's who you are. That's who you are. You're just showing it to us here without any mask. So I feel like as an artist, I can say I feel kind of the duty to go beyond all the masks that all of the people in power or not are using to survive and bring the bare humanity of the moment. And I feel that now this piece is very relevant, I have to say. Like when we start talking about it in 2000, whatever, before 15, 13 or something, it felt I was a little nervous because I felt the conditions in the United States were very different. Censorship was not, it has always existed, but it was not so present. People did not have to stop and think twice what they were going to say because they're going to get into big troubles. And I feel now I'm very excited that the piece is being shown up because it's a reminder that things that happen in one place can happen in another place.
Stuart, do you have anything you want to add along those lines or about?
Yeah, I mean, again, what I find so powerful about this piece is that, it is not a documentary. And Tania and I were talking about our high regard for Steve McQueen's film Hunger, which also has this very intense physical charge to it. And I remember when it came out, people criticized him for not giving enough information about the story that it depicts. But he said it's not a documentary. This is about getting into a different physical, sensorial space. So the fact that this is about a very specific moment in Cuba under Castro, but that it really has a ripple effect, so that it, we can think about the issues it raises in the current situation or, long before. I mean, again, going back to Plato's Cave. And I guess having been there in 2000 also, I mean, it really was a particularly charged moment. And Bush had been elected just 2 weeks prior to the opening of the biennial, but Clinton had opened up relations to the island. And so as Tania suggested, I mean, this piece directly addresses that opening up and the fact that so many Americans were coming to Cuba. And obviously now we're in another major shift where Obama had opened up relations, and now most likely our relationship to Latin America is a bit fraught at the moment. So we'll see where that goes, but I think there are a lot of ways of thinking about, the specifics of a political moment and to draw out, maybe deeper narratives just about humanity and about citizenship.
And as an artist, I feel that I'm very invested in trying to see how can I create a lexicon, a visual lexicon of oppression. How can, as an artist, I can challenge the sense not only of what is art, but the sense of how can we represent oppression? How can we represent, injustice in a way?
And I think what is so important in this, I love the fact you said it's not a documentary, nor is it strictly representational, as you're saying, you're representing oppression, but it's experiential. And I think that's what I also want to really underscore here, is the power of this work is extraordinary in that way. It's more sensorial and it's inescapable in that sense.
But we had a very good politician in Cuba for a very long time, and the reason why Fidel was such a good politician is because he understood the power of enter people's emotional landscape as a way to make politics. And I think that is something that I have learned as a citizen in Cuba, and I have translated that into my work. Like, that's the kind of a strategy I use in my work. And as I said before, sometimes the most important things in your life or political events that will define your future are so immaterial. They look so frugal. They look so like, when this happened, you know? And that's why I think performance for me is so valuable. But also the fact that, as you said before, when you experience things with your body, that there is another memory there that you carry with you. And yeah.
This may be a good moment to open it up to the audience to see if there are questions here. We're happy to take a few questions. This has been a terrific discussion, but I see a lot of hands already. Meg, do you want to start here? Perhaps wait for the microphone so we can all hear you. Thank you.
I spent an inordinate amount of time in the exhibit, and I found that the most moving thing were the very acted and stylized movements of the four figures. How did that come to be orchestrated? It truly made the thing alive and challenged, I'm sure not only me, but pretty much everyone who came in there. It seemed as if the actors were inventing it themselves, which I guess is the best definition of good acting. But I'm just wondering how that all came about.
Well, I see the performers very happy. I am that happy that you make that comment. And actually, if you guys want to say something, please. Originally, in the year 2000, I was dealing with the idea of, I always struggle with the idea of representation and symbolism, because I feel like the symbolic can be very quickly co-opted politically, because the meaning is so open and so much into anybody's interpretation that then you can really change the conversation. So this piece is a moment where I actually changed. This is the last piece probably where I use the symbolic in my work. And I came up with the ideas because I wanted to have a very clear idea of, for example, should I say maybe the interpretation of the gestures, or, you know, so the idea of, like, when you take something out of your mouth, when you're trying to reach for the words that you have been swallowing yourself because you self-censor, which for me is the highest, most sophisticated way to do censorship. When you self-censor, then they don't have to work. You've done the work for them. We had this one about bowing, which is very evident, very self-explanatory. There is one element that I really like when they are bowing, that their eyes keep looking at you, even when you go down. So I think that creates this kind of like, yeah, I'm bowing, but it's a little more threatening like that. The anger is still in you. The other one was brushing, and that came because I saw a Kurosawa film, and I loved the part where the character was washing the hands endlessly to release the blood that was not there. So I wanted to bring that idea of, like, when you are feeling guilty, but nothing to be feel guilty about. And the last gesture we created together here. So we did a little alteration to the collection because there was one gesture I never liked, that never was perfect. And then in the process of rehearsing and warming up and stuff, that was actually the performers' idea in a way, because they came up with this, and I was like, that's great. So, and then we started working on it together, so we kind of workshopped the last one. Yeah.
I also, the one other sort of more historical artwork.
Sorry.
Oh,
and
please.
the last one, I didn't, sorry. The last one is when the police stop you. So I think that also talks about the present as well.
The other work I meant to mention, which was made roughly 13 years after Tania's, but I think there are really interesting connections, as Kara Walker's major commission for the Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn. And, you know, both pieces have this idea of these sort of attendants, like standing guard in front of, in this case, of course, Castro, in the case of Kara Walker, the large mammy figure. Both obviously hinge on this notion of sugar and the slave economy. They're very different artworks, but they're both very powerful and very emotionally affecting artworks. And I think there's just something to think about there. It's an interesting connection, maybe. And just in terms of the kinds of gestures that exist, you know, in this piece, it's interesting. But maybe, Tanya, you could also just briefly mention why the performers are all men as well.
Well, that's a longer conversation, but I felt that for that piece, because it was about Cuba, it was important to bring the machismo in Cuba as well. The fact that it felt like, at least then, there was no role for women. All the heroes are men. The few heroes we have were the wife of, or they are like in the second or third layer of you know, you don't know much about, like if I say their name, Celia Sanchez, nobody knows who she is, you know, Che Guevara, everybody knows. So I think you see the difference of the role in the revolution of female. And I also wanted to be honest, I also wanted to make this connection with the slaves of Miguel Angel, and they were male as well. And they were also unfinished figures. Like for me, the darkness washed out some part of them, like if they were not finished people, if there were people who were either taken part of them or, you know, so that's part of what it was. I have to say that for many, even in the selection process, I know that it was hard for some Cuban male to have a woman saying, I want you to be naked for doing this and that. That was a little intense for some people who didn't make it onto the last round for the performance.
Another question, perhaps? That's great. Good question, thanks. Anyone else? Yep, over here.
Hi, Tanya. I was actually at the 2000 Biennial, and I was one of the unfortunate people who weren't able to see your installation because it had been closed by the time I arrived. And I came down as a journalist specifically. So my question is, this happened in 2000. This installation was conceived in 2000, and today it's 18 years later. How would you say the political climate has changed? And maybe you could speak about, in relation to the alternative biennial that's being organized and the arrest of the artist who was curating it. Thank you.
I feel that, well, I feel like in 61, when Fidel met with the artists and the writers who were protesting or worried about censorship in the arts after the documentary PM came out, and when he did the gesture in front of all these artists to put his gun first on the table and then conclude the meeting by saying, with the revolution everything, against the revolution, without the revolution no rights, meaning it is in a legal term, I think that has defined not only my experience or the experience of the artists you're talking about, but the experience of artists since 61 until now. There is a long history, and something I've been trying to stretch all the time, even when I was in prison in 2014 and 15, that it's not me, it's not him, it's a policy. It's a government policy of making people stop not saying things, but thinking about things. Trying to stop people not accusing, but even asking a question to know more. A good example, Fast and Furious came to Cuba. the rumor is they pay 10, I think the rumor is that they pay $4 million. Nobody knows today what the money is. Every time I ask, I go to prison because they don't want people to ask questions, you know. So the accountability is something that doesn't exist in that context. Every time you have an artist that even with good intentions, as in my case, I am trying to do a project, the projects I do in Cuba are with the elements of the original revolution, you know, ethics, you know. Or for example, now for the Alternative Biennial, which I'm helping also realize in May, the government is offended just because you have an alternative idea. You haven't done it yet, and this is very interesting. I always say that the censorship in Cuba has changed from first they hear there was a problem, and they went to a show and took the stuff out. Then they start going to the artist's studio to see what the hell are they doing so they can stop it before it's shown. Then now what they do is actually try to envision, they know what your behavior, and they try to envision what is your next step before you even think about it. I have been in interrogation sessions where they are accusing me of things I haven't even think about. And I'm like, thank you, that's a great idea, maybe I do it, you know? So I think what we see now in Cuba is a combination between a government that doesn't trust its own people with a paranoia that is not anymore of us, the citizen, but them, the police, you know. So, I don't know if that answers.
And one more question, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a very, very powerful piece. I'm still shaking. I really wonder how you're going to tackle the question of conservation of the piece and documentation and so forth. You were saying that you wanted like a multi-sensory recording of that, but which I can hardly imagine how that is possible. And I just wanted to say that I was really touched by the fact that you said that there is no universal experience and that it would be patronizing to say so, and that you really pointed out the fact how important the subjectivity is in experiencing that. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that.
What was the first question? I'm sorry.
Conservation.
Conservation. When I was young, I always been fascinated by the material and by things that deteriorate. So all my drawings at the beginning were coffee and tea and things that are acid. So I haven't sold a lot of my work for many reasons, but that's maybe one of them. And I remember meeting a conservator who became a friend, and I was like, oh my God, nobody. And she's like, don't worry, that's not your problem. That's my problem. That's my job. Just do whatever you want. And that liberated me so much. Because I was this like, oh my God, this is too big, this is too small, this is, oh my God, I want to do this tomato juice, whatever. No, we can't. So that liberated me. So in that sense, I will pass the question into the institution. But no, also I think the museum has been super, I cannot say this word, thorough. And we have worked for a long time, for like 3 years or so now, in order to do the piece. And I'm very happy to say that the documentation for this piece is multisensorial as well, the documentation itself. Not only we have the data of the original place, like images of the space, the dimension, etc., but we have, actually even for the performers, we had a little reading text for them to understand some historical data in general, but also about the piece. But also I think it's going to be, for me, right now the most important part is recording the experience of Cubans who come here and have a reaction because they have lived something. Because in 20, 30 years, Cuba might be like any other country. And people will forget. For example, I did a piece a while ago where I used some reference to Auschwitz. And I was sadly impressed that people in the exhibition, some people were like, what is this saying? Like, that people didn't recognize the sign. So that made me think, okay, historical memory is erased, sometimes for the good reason, but we should never forget. And I think that's what we're trying to preserve here also. Not only how it looks, how it smells, but also the emotional memory.
I mean, I think I've always said, the audience is an archive of its own. And to your point, there is no universal audience. The audience is comprised of very specific subjectivities. So we would like to capture a broad spectrum of those subjectivities as much as we can. Also the performers, also other people who witnessed the first iteration in 2000, and I know there are a few others in this room who did, so please let us know what you think. But I'm always in awe of our conservation colleagues, but in this case, really, none of us could be doing what we're doing without our exhibitions team as well, and in particular Matthew Cox. I just want to say his name because he's been really unbelievably heroic, not only in terms of reconstructing the space to the nth degree. I mean, really, Tania went back to Havana, was sending us photographs of the original walls. He went to extraordinary detail to get it right. But maybe what's not broadly known is the kind of sugarcane that you encounter on the floors. Technically, that kind of process, the industry has moved far beyond that process. It doesn't really exist anymore. Matthew is from Florida originally, and he went down and spent 2 weeks trying to locate somewhere that still produced this kind of sugarcane bagasse, and found a group of old men that are still doing it, almost by hand practically, with these clunky old machines. And we've got great documentation of that trip. But I think he's now probably the worldwide expert on sugarcane bagasse. But so we've tried to capture, all of this information as much as we can.
We also are giving the performers the opportunity to record some of their experiences or memories or data in terms of the gesture or stuff that maybe in the future can help to other performers when this is done again.
That's great. I'm glad you asked that question because there is an awful lot of research and work that goes on behind the scenes, and it's not only with a talented staff, but it's also, thank you, Tania, for being so available and such a willing partner to build that information and legacy, and as a way for us to how to think about this.
But I have an agenda. That's why I was so available.
Great. I had
My agenda is I'm so into people buying performance that I need them to have a good experience, so they keep doing it with other artists.
Anyways. So anyway, I want to thank you both for this great conversation, which continues and can continue in a number of forms. I'm holding up a brochure that accompanies the exhibition, hot off the press, and I noticed there's a conversation between the two of you in here, so I look forward to reading that. And there are a number of programs that will also amplify this exhibition and this conversation. There's a special workshop that you are leading for a group. I don't know if you want to say a quick, short word about that.
I think it's still open, so people want to register. February 9 and 10, I'm going to be partnering with the education department. Pablo Helguera is my contact person there who is working with me on that. And we're going to do a workshop about arte útil, which is another concept I'm working a lot lately. And also, to your point about censorship before, we are doing a collateral program, cinema program, with films that have been censored since '59 until now. So actually it's censored cinema during the revolution.
That program starts March 9, 10, and 11. It's 3 consecutive days of intense film program, and that information has just been put out there. It's in the press kits, it'll be online and so forth. And there's also an evening conversation, I think, where, Stuart, you're moderating a discussion.
And we're thrilled that the two participants beyond Tania and me are Gerardo Mosquera, who initiated the Havana Biennial to begin with, was actually pushed out of the biennial the year that Tania's installation took place in 2000. And I remember a Mexican curator named Cuauhtemoc Medina reading a manifesto in the defense of Gerardo, but he remains one of the key voices in Cuban art history. So he'll be joining us. He was also an early champion of Tania's work. And Claire Bishop, who is a well-known art historian who's really focused, again, on this idea of delegational performance, performance that involves a greater degree of participation from the audience, and who's frequently identified Tania's work as a crucial part of that history.
So thank you again. This exhibition sort of kicks off our winter-spring program of exhibitions. Next week we'll be opening another exhibition of a historic figure from Brazil, Tarsila do Amaral. There's a press conference next Tuesday, February 6th. Later in March, there's a new iteration of new photography, and that's followed by a major retrospective on Adrian Piper. So it's a very, very rich season, and I hope to see you, the audience, here at future press conferences coming up this winter, whether here in the auditorium or online. Thank you for tuning in. So again, Tania, thank you very much. Stuart, congratulations to you and your team. Look forward to a great run of this show. Thank you.
Thank you.